grateful to welcome you, and I'd be happy to introduce you. Just we've
Please do.
got some young people. Anna, we have Ale, Philo, Francisco, we have Drisha, we have Komal, and we have Dr. Norma with us here right now. So there's people who are otherwise based in India, the US, and Mexico, present with us at the moment.
Good. So
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll start with an introduction, if I may, and then I'll request Anna to help guide us through the rest of the conversation. And we're very excited to have this conversation. And I warmly welcome you again, sir, and welcome to everyone to the POP Leadership Conversations focused on climate as a tribute to our chief mentor. This project aims to strengthen youth leadership and explore tactics that empower the youth to take action and tackle the most pressing environmental issues faced globally. We are conducting a series of conversations on leadership strategies, recommendations, reflections, and examples, each focused on global leadership and a different pressing environmental issue. This initiative is designed and implemented as a tribute to our chief mentor, late Dr. R.K. Pachauri. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Sri Nitin Desai ji, former Under-Secretary General, Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations. He's also the chairperson of the board of TERI, which is the Energy and Resources Institute. So with that, sir, I'm delighted and most privileged and honored to warmly welcome you. Thank you very much once again for making the time for this important leadership conversation, with no doubt will inspire many, many, many young minds. So thank you once again, and I'll request Anna if she'd start by providing your bio, please. Anna, thank you.
Of course. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. I will now go ahead and introduce our guest speaker. Sir Nitin Desai is an Indian economist and an international civil servant. He was Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations from 1992 to 2003. Nitin Desai was a part of the Planning Commission of the Government of India, where he served in various capacities. His principal work was the establishment of a cost-benefit appraisal of public investment projects. From September 1985 to March 1987, he served as Senior Economic Advisor for the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission, where he introduced the concept of sustainable development and was responsible for drafting key chapters dealing with this aspect in the report of Our Common Future. And as Dr. Ash mentioned, he is also part of the chair of TERI, the Institute of Energy and Resources. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We will be speaking, as Dr. Ash mentioned, with a few young people from across the world. And I would like to ask Dr. Ash Pachauri to help us with the first question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful, sir, for your incredible insights and the many opportunities that we've had so far to talk with you, especially about sustainable development, the role of young people. And I'd love to hear your perspective on what leadership in this context means to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me first say that I welcome this opportunity to speak to young people, because in many ways, it is my belief that the realization of sustainable development depends greatly on the engagement of young people, not just in talking about it, not just in learning about it, but in actually the decision-making on how we are going to tackle this challenge. And I say this because if you look at it, the key underlying concept of sustainable development is intergenerational equity. That I should not do anything to meet the demands of today by compromising the ability of future generations to meet their demands. That was the way the definition was framed. when we wrote the Brundtland report. And it's therefore absolutely essential to ask oneself, will this happen? Now, the reality today is that the power of decision making in politics and in the economy rests in the hands of people who are responsible for creating the problem. They are the ones who will decide how fast we will act, how we will act, and so on. But now, certainly when it comes to issues which are of immediate political relevance, like air pollution in Delhi or something like this, they may act sufficiently vigorously. But what about things which are going to have an impact 30, 40, 50 years from now, when they won't be around, when I won't be around to face those consequences? The people who would be there to face those consequences have no voice in the decision making of today in politics and economics. It is as if you say that if I cause an accident with my car, then I will decide how soon to call the ambulance and the police, not the people who are affected. So it's absolutely essential that we work out something by which we give a voice to the people who are affected. Now, who are the people who can speak for that? It is young people. It is young people because all of you youngsters are going to be around in 2050. Then if we don't act, we are going to face serious problems. So we have to find ways not just of listening to them, as we are doing now, but also of engaging them more effectively in the decision-making process. Yes, it is true. They often in many countries may not have the voting rights because they're below the voting age. They certainly don't have the economic power because that rests in the hands of people who own companies and so on. So we have to find creative ways of doing this. Before I turn to the next question, let me just here quickly mention, today and tomorrow, there is a meeting in Stockholm on the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Environment Conference. And because it was in many ways the first major international conference which addressed issues of the environment. Later, we broadened it to include integrating environment and development. Now, for that meeting, 2 reports have been prepared. One report has been prepared by a group of researchers called Stockholm Plus 50 report. And it's an open-minded report because these people have no direct stake in power. They are academics and they are researchers who are thinking about these problems. But they have also prepared a youth report, a report prepared by 1,000 youngsters from 91 countries. And both of those are today on the table in the UN international meeting, which is meeting in Stockholm. What I'm going to do is on the chat box, I'm going to put the link to these reports. And I would urge some of you to look at the reports. Look first at the youth report. Actually, the youth report was one interesting thing for me was that though I'm 80 years old, 81, sorry, the youngsters asked me to write the forward for that report. But that's not the reason why I'm asking you to look at it. I'm asking you to look at it because of how the youngsters have succeeded in putting across their views on how we need to act. So I shall put that up on the chat box so that people can locate those reports and read them. So let me stop here. Now I'll see what further questions come up.
Thank you. This is absolutely invaluable, and I think that all of us need to have a read of the report. I'm excited also about reading your forward, and I just wanted to say I think this is so important because youth are certainly leaders of tomorrow, but also of today. And I think, as you mentioned, that leadership is in fact taking action, being part of that process of formulating important decisions which will pave the way to the future, which will impact generations to come. So certainly young people have a stake in this, and I sincerely appreciate your sharing the report here. We'll definitely circulate this very widely. Thank you very much for that very important perspective. And with that, I'll request Anna to take us forward, please. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ash, and thank you, sir, for sharing those reports with us. I'm looking forward to reading them after the session. And I just want, before we go on to the next question, I just want to do a quick parenthesis to correct myself earlier. TERI is the Energy and Resources Institute. So I think I said that wrong. But now I would like to hand it over to Alejandra Fragoso, who will be helping us with our next question.
Hello, it's an honor for me. Well, how has the meaning of sustainable development evolved? What is true sustainable development?
What is the, sorry, can you repeat it? What was your question?
Sorry. How has the meaning of sustainable development evolved? What is true sustainable development?
Well, sustainable development was basically an idea which has been around for some time, particularly in areas like forestry and fisheries. Well, I introduced it for the broader reason in the Brundtland Commission when I was inducted for the drafting of the report. Because what had happened there was a certain conflict between the people who came from the environmental side. Most of them were from the West, Bill Ruckelshaus was the head of the EPA in USA and so on. And there were a whole lot of people from developing countries whose primary concern was growth for poverty eradication and upbringing. And there was a sense of conflict between them. The environmentalists thinking that this concern about growing and increasing consumption, etc., is one of the greatest challenges that we face for protecting the planet. There were reports like the limits to growth and so on, which had come out at that time. The developing people, on the other hand, thought that here there is already a world which is very unequal. There's a few very well-developed countries and a large number of underdeveloped countries. How can you say stop the processes of growth because they will damage the environment? We need to have growth in the poorer countries in order to meet the essential needs of not just today, but also tomorrow. And sustainable development was an idea of bridging this gap between the two. That development is hurt if you do not protect the environment. Environment will not get protected unless you also worry about people's livelihoods and so on. Let me take a little example to give, small example I'll give you. A friend of mine made a lot of money. He actually sold his company to one of a major US company. And he decided he wanted to do something useful with his money. So he set up a foundation, and the focus of the foundation was protecting tigers. So he started giving money for tiger protection, putting up cameras in order to see how many tigers there are in a forest, etc. Then slowly he realized that you can't protect tigers unless you also protect forests. So then he expanded his limit and said, instead of just giving money for tiger protection, I shall give money for forest protection. But after some time, he realized that I can't protect a forest if I ignore the needs and demands of the poor people who live in and around forests. And today, most of his money is going for that. That is sustainable development. That you must connect environment and development. Both are necessary, not just protecting environment in order to protect development, but ensuring development so that you can protect the environment on which people depend for their livelihood. This is the idea behind sustainable development, connecting the two sides together. You're not fully succeeded in that because it's like a bridge. It's like a bridge. And when you have a bridge, the people on both sides of the bridge, on either side of the river, don't necessarily feel a sense of ownership about the bridge. What we need is to ensure that people do cross over regularly, that we do not talk of development in isolation from sustainability. We do not talk of environment in isolation from livelihoods, and that we think of the two together always and have integrated programs which tackle both the environmental protection issue and the livelihood issue at the same time. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a great answer. I think that was very interesting how you mentioned the idea of bridging this gap. Now, I would like to ask the next question, which is, from a political point of view, what hinders sustainable development? If we have the necessary, if we have the solutions necessary to have sustainable development in cities and rural areas, what limits their implementation?
What I would say is that basically today we have translated sustainable development into goals. So we have sustainable development goals, which the United Nations has announced. They're all very good, sensible goals. In climate change also, we announced goals, net zero by 2050 and so on. To me, how you reach those goals is as important as the goal itself. Suppose I have a goal, as I do in sustainable development, that everybody will have drinking water and water for household use by such and such date. But suppose I meet that particular goal by exploiting water resources in an unsustainable way, then what? So my thesis is that when we are talking of sustainability, setting up goals is important, but setting up a path on how you reach those goals, things which are not permissible for reaching that goal, things which are desirable for reaching that goal, things which are on which you can be neutral. So that is the point I would stress. Even now, today in climate change, we have been in a lot of focus on goals, but not enough focus on how do you get to that goal. What should I be doing now in order to reach 2050 zero net emissions?
Thank you so much. I completely agree. We should also focus on how we reach these goals. I would now like to hand it over to Komal, who will be helping us with the next question.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening, sir. So my question to you is, how did serving as Under Secretary General, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, United Nations, help you integrate these concepts into the international agenda? And how did this shape the way we combat environmental issues from an international perspective?
I would say that the importance of the UN in this whole process was ecosystems do not respect national boundaries. Even in a big country like United States and Canada, you share rivers. That emissions which come from one country can end up in another country. So the ecosystems do not respect national boundaries. So if you want a policy which will address these challenges to the ecosystem, then you must try and do so as a cooperative exercise amongst countries. I would say that we started in Stockholm with something which raised the challenge of environment up. And it led to some very positive results in countries setting up environmental organizations and ministries after 1972. What we did in Rio was to move a step forward and say, connect this with development, because there was a lot of world cooperation on development, aid and all sorts of things. We said, let us connect these things and bring in the notions of long-term equity and solidarity into this whole process. And we developed what we called Agenda 21, which was an agenda with huge agenda running into hundreds of pages, which was negotiated and agreed by all the countries of the world. And we had a whole lot of presidents and prime ministers turning up to support them. So what was the role of the UN? The role of the UN was in escalating the political level of commitment, of saying this is not just something to be left to an environment agency. This is something which requires attention at the top of the government. That's why we had 100 presidents and prime ministers coming to the Rio meeting. Now that was a big difference. Stockholm in 1972 had only 2 heads of government there. The head of government of Sweden, of course, because the meeting was in Stockholm. Olof Palme was there. And the other one was from a developing country, a lady who strongly believed in the importance of linking environment and development, the Prime Minister of my country, Indira Gandhi. She was the only head of state other than the Prime Minister of Sweden who attended Stockholm. But in Rio, we had 100. Even George Bush was there, but he was not the most enthusiastic environmentalist. But he was also there. So I'd say that what the UN contributed was in escalating the political level of dialogue on this issue, of focusing on the inter-country cooperation which is required, of addressing issues about what are the legislative arrangements. And the Rio conference led to negotiated treaties on a variety of things. The most important of that is, of course, climate change. And it also did something once more. It opened the dialogue in the UN to non-governmental actors. It was not just a dialogue between government officials and politicians. It was a dialogue which brought in non-governmental organizations whose concern was not national interest, but an issue interest. That they were interested in protecting the rights, say, of women, or protecting forests, or wildlife. And they came there with that issue orientation, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So this is that broadening of the dialogue, global dialogue. So it was not just between governments, but also included NGOs. This is, I think, the contribution the UN made. UN's contribution is raising awareness, establishing this as a intergovernmental issue which requires multilateral cooperation. And that, I think, is what I believe I felt was the most useful part of my work as Undersecretary General. I was in charge. I was also a Deputy Secretary General of the Rio Conference, Secretary General of the Johannesburg, and all sorts of things like that. I won't go into those details. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now like to hand it over to Francisco, who will be asking the next question.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And okay, for our next question, we have already talked a little bit about this, but maybe we can go deeper with this question. So the question is, what role do citizens play in sustainable development, and how to get them involved with its local and global dimensions? And also, what will be your message and advice to the youth of the world?
I would say that the question you raised is quite a challenging one, because our political systems are still very old-fashioned. They are not systems designed to bring into decision-making all those who are affected by it. At the international level, we have tried to address that through the UN by saying, okay, what a country does affects another country. Therefore, what it does should be subject to some form of global agreement and negotiation. But within the country, how are we doing this? Part of the answer lies in democracy, that everybody should have a role, but that's not enough, as you know. And I think that community participation in decision-making is, to me, the beginning of the answer, particularly starting at a local level. If I take an Indian village, when I leave what is to be done to the bureaucrats who run the different departments of the government, I will not get the same creative answer as I get if I also include local people. And we do have, in India, it so happens we do have local institutions in the form of village assemblies and so on. And there are things that are happening on this front in India. So at a local level, community participation certainly will help. Now, it's true that if community participation in decision making is easier to do in a small place like a village. How do I do it in a big place, in a big city? How can I say that I'll have citizen assemblies in order to take decisions? This is where I think a degree of engagement with this community on sustainability issues has to come in the way in which the political dialogue is run. You don't depend only on the once in 5-year elections or once in 2-year, once in 3-year elections. Have a systematic process of saying governments will not do this without a process of dialogue, if necessary, even a referendum on this. Third, much greater exposure, spread of knowledge and information. The one good thing that has happened over the past 2-3 decades is that a lot of knowledge and information has emerged about how to handle these issues, including climate change is the most obvious one, but in other areas also. We must find ways of communicating this. Now, let me give a small instance of what this happens. A lot of it is done in academic institutions which use English or some other language. We must find ways of translating this, putting this into languages which people can understand and read. Listen also to their perception. One of the organizations I was involved in, did a survey of how people at the ground level saw climate change. And it was fascinating, the answers that we got. So this was in the hill areas, north of the capital in India. And there, when we went, people, we saw that. They said, that tree used to start flowering only in April. Now it's started flowering in February. That spring used to flow till June. Now it dries up by March, and so on. They had that perception. And I still remember a farmer saying, when he was asked what his problem about the weather climate was, he says, my problem is I can no longer read the weather. I cannot look at the sky and I cannot know what is going to happen tomorrow. This idea of climate uncertainty is, I think, what is really most important. And I have been arguing for some time now that we should not just talk in terms of climate change, but climate uncertainty, and combine actions to reduce carbon emissions and other things to reduce temperature increase, along with adaptation and resilience, measures to improve our capacity to cope with uncertainty. So I would say that the way we should go about this is by broadening our political process, broadening our process of information dissemination, and also learning much more by talking to people at the ground level. That is what we need in order to reach out. How do you get young people involved in this? Now, I'd say here, one thing that young people, because the proportion of young people who are educated, who are open to ideas, new ideas, and so on, is always greater in any country compared to the average for the population as a whole. So I would like to see a process which gives greater voice to the groups of, I would say, teenage groups, teenage youngsters, people who have studied, who have learned a lot, who are articulate, who are going to be the people who will run the politics and the economy of the country in the decades to come, and find ways of hearing them and giving them greater voice in the decision-making process. I've seen this in villages in India. Because of the organizations I've been involved in, I often go to villages to see how projects are doing. And what I've noticed is that the people who talk, the local people who talk, it's just two things which struck me. One, almost always it's young people who tell you what is happening, whether it is succeeding or not. And the other thing that struck me was how much the local women were articulate on this. Now, these are the two groups who are not very powerful in politics. Let's make them more powerful.
Thank you so much, sir. I completely agree. That was a very, very interesting answer. So thank you for answering that. And thank you, Daniel, Francisco, for your question. And we do have another question here in the chat from Kevin. Unfortunately, Kevin doesn't have access to a microphone, so I'm going to read it from him. You covered a bit about this a few minutes ago, but maybe we can go in deeper. It says, you were in the international affairs since the starting of climate change topic on the worldwide agenda. What do you think we could feel? Do you think we could feel proud of what we've achieved so far, or what are you afraid of? What we're getting too behind to reach our goals?
I would say there are 2 or 3 areas where I see progress. One is in the global consensus, scientific consensus on climate. When we started the climate negotiations in 1990 and the treaty was open for signature in 92, the report which was produced by the scientific panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, did not say categorically that the temperature increases that we were observing were because of human influence. They did not say that. And there were a lot of skeptics. The United States, the most powerful of the countries, was quite skeptical about whether this climate change was due to human action and whether it did. There was a famous climate skeptic was the chief of staff in the president's office. You had companies like Exxon, which are openly challenging the science of climate change. You had wealthy people, particularly in Texas, who are funding campaigns against this area. That has gone. Exxon today has a program on getting to net zero. Well, they didn't do it on their own, but what happened was, and this is where the NGO part comes in, the 3 organizations which are committed to environment managed to buy shares and get onto the board of Exxon. And today, Exxon, which was a leading climate skeptic, then we started in 1990, has announced a policy on net zero. Climate skepticism today is rare, and mostly it is not absent, but is mostly treated as an eccentric thing now and then. There's not a single scientific academy in the world which does not accept that we have climate change, that climate change has been induced by human actions, and therefore has to be addressed by human actions also. There are a handful of skeptics who may occasionally speak up, but none of them have serious influence anywhere, including in places like the United States. So, and now, of course, under the new administration, the United States has announced a strong commitment on addressing climate issues. So that's one great advantage, that the scientific consensus on what is happening on the climate front has become stronger. And the IPCC today has thousands and thousands of people participating in its work. Second, there has been a tremendous expansion and growth of global networks of climate action-oriented organizations. And if I try to list them, it will take me an hour. There's so many of them. They're doing first-rate work in reaching out to people, in presenting facts, and so on. Today, on climate, there's absolutely no difficulty in getting the facts that you want. They're all easily accessible and available. And one of the reasons for this is the spread of the internet. I tend to remind people that the World Wide Web, as you know it, did not exist when we did the Rio conference. The internet was there, but the internet was based on the sort of working directly with a computer. There was no visually helpful process, or HTML linkages of the sort that you get in the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web came after Rio, and it has made a huge difference in the way in which people can connect with one another in order to change it. Third thing that has happened is that, in my view, corporates have been more far-sighted than governments. And they have invested in research on climate mitigation technologies. You can see this today in the rapid spread of renewable energy. More money is being invested today in power production from renewable sources than from non-renewable sources. And the reason for that is the technology development, which has reduced costs dramatically over time. In fact, I argue that we are already in the midst of an energy transition. And it doesn't matter whether governments do anything or not. You're going to get this energy transition, whether governments like it or not, or whether you don't need a climate challenge in order to this. It's going to happen because of the economics. And there are many other areas, electric vehicles, for instance. Look at those of you who are in the United States know how companies like Tesla and so on are flourishing. Look at the list of the companies which are flourishing today. In the list, that none of them are these resource-intensive companies. Most of them are companies which are not resource-intensive. This is a third great area of advance. Where we have not succeeded enough is in getting sufficient commitment at the national and the level for getting action going now and getting international cooperation working more effectively. This is something where we still have a lot of ground to cover, but we are moving. The Paris Agreement was a good forward step. So I'd say, yes, it has happened. Many things have improved, but we are still not there. We are still not there. We managed to get the car moving on the road, but it's still juddering around a little, and we need to do more work in order to get it moving more clearly, more rapidly on the road we need to travel to get to a sustainable world.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. And I like how you summarized where we are doing good and where we need more work. So thank you for answering Kevin's question. We do have a few more minutes. If anyone else would like to ask an additional question or a follow-up, please feel free to raise your hand. And in the meantime, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Ash.
Sure, I do agree. I think Francisco has a question. Did you raise your hand, Francisco? Sorry.
No, I don't have a question yet.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks.
So, sorry, I thought you did. But I did wanted to say I think that this has been extremely insightful, and thank you very much, sir, for sharing. The historic context as well, which I think is so important to understand as we move ahead. And you brought up a really important point about equity in the voices of women and the role of communities in sharing their perspective. I love your thoughts on how we can actually help make this happen much more, and the role that young people can play. This is something that at the POP movement we have been quite focused on, and wish to engage many more of the indigenous communities, the women, and people who are not typically part of this, but are actually experiencing climate change in almost every dimension of their lives, maybe even way more than people in urban areas. So I'd love your thoughts, sir, on how we can help propel more action in this area.
Language. You'll have to go and talk in not just one language, but in the many that exist in the minds of people. Right. This is the most challenging task which is there before the people who are working in this area like you and all of your friends. But you can obviously not reach out to every single person, but start expanding the range of languages with which you reach out to people.
Yeah, that's very important. Thank you. And I just thought I'd check if anybody else had a question. Philo, did you have a question, please? Okay, I think we have one more question here, which is, do you feel the current situation is such as the inflation war and the COVID situation that we are facing has made us lose focus on climate change? Or on the contrary, will we be able to understand the roots of all and therefore do something about it?
I don't see evidence of loss of attention on this. We are still getting enough action. In fact, one thing which will make it easier is that on fossil fuel, with fossil fuel prices rising, the shift from fossil fuels to renewables may even be accelerated by this event. What will be a problem, of course, is the fact that some countries are going to slip into a recession, and how they try and get out of that recession will be a major challenge. And so I can't say that there is no challenge ahead, but I'm not as worried about it as, say, I would have been in 20, 30 years ago. I believe that the basic thing of fossil fuel mitigation has started, and there's very little that is going to stop it. That is the reason why one can be optimistic. But there are many other things we have to do besides that, on water, on land, on oceans. And most important, we also need to worry about equity. So I'd say that there is a lot of work ahead. I think I wouldn't worry too much about fossil fuel reduction. I'll worry more increasingly about the other things. So people like you, who are young people, who are capable of reaching out, who are capable of keeping track of all the work that is going on, of crystallizing it into something which is easily communicated, you have an important task ahead of you. Getting politicians to listen to you is a greater challenge. And you can do it at the time of election, but how do you do it in between elections is a greater challenge. Okay? Good.
Thank you. That's absolutely on the mark. And I think for those, I mean, we've seen recently in the elections in Australia, and of course, there's been a lot of amplification of voices of young people, but we've seen a change in government because votes do matter. And for those who are of the age to vote, I think that's a very important piece of advice, that we need to exercise that right. But at the same time, there's all the years in between the time those votes are cast. So I just want to say that I think we've learned so much from this conversation, and I think one of the key things that you've shared, which I think is an underlying catalyst, is the fact that we need to share knowledge, and doing this in a way that's accessible for the diverse communities, language, being able to, today we have access to the internet, and for those who are offline, engaging people, even from communities, especially those that are not otherwise reached, in order to achieve equity and to ensure equity is key. And I just want to say we've had a lot of learning from you, and I want to thank you very much for your insights. I also wanted to say, before we close the conversation, sir, if you had anything else you would like to add as we conclude this conversation, but I think begin a very important phase of our journey in terms of being able to scale and really get out there, reach many more young people, which is really what our goal is. I'd love to hear if there's anything else.
Yeah, there's one thing I would suggest you. Have a look at this youth report which was prepared for the Stockholm conference. And after people have had time to read that report, which does include material on the questions that many of you have raised as to how do we actually have an effect? How do we have an impact? Have a look at that report and then perhaps organize some internal dialogues between the people who are involved in your exercise on how can we take this forward. You know, that is perhaps something that would, on the language issue is a more challenging one. And I don't have an easy answer to it. But one possibility we may look at is to have smaller national organizations connected with yours who will handle things in the local language and then in some ways connect with a larger group. Now you take Latin America, you can't work there unless you do it in Spanish and Portuguese. You know? You try and do it yes, of course, there are people there who know English. The reality is, if you really want to reach out to people, you have to do that. You know? So that is a more challenging task, but I don't think you can do it by someone international group. You'll have to start asking people at a local level to have a network of local networks, you know, which will work together. Try all these things out. It'll take time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is absolutely invaluable. I want to thank you very much once again, sir, for being a precious part of the POP family, for sharing your time and insights with us, which are very precious. And I also want to convey my gratitude to all the young people who are here with us in this conversation and those that join us online. We really do look forward to taking on next steps as you've outlined would be the most sort of effective way of looking at this challenge and then tackling it systematically. So thank you once again, and we look forward to staying in touch and keeping you posted as well.
Thank you, and good luck to all of you as you get on with this task that you've taken on for yourself.
Thank you very much, sir. Would you mind if we got a picture before?
How do you get a picture? I need to comb my hair.
Thank you so much. Anyone who can get
let me put my rather notchy background into
okay, sure. Thank you.
Blur it.
Yes.
You can see that one thing in the background is an air purifier.
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, that's needed. But let's get the screenshot. Thank you so much once again. I'll share this with you, sir.
Okay.
And much gratitude once again, and we look forward to follow up from here. Thank you, and also for the links.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was great. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Desai. Thank you so much.